Hi, everybody. Tonight we will wander together into the shadowed and lamp-lit corridors of ancient Rome, where marble halls echoed with music, soft laughter, and whispered invitations. This is not a tale of hurried scandal or coarse excess, but a slow unwrapping of history's silk wrappings, a patient exploration of what truly took place in the intimate gatherings of Rome's elite. We will linger over the setting, the scent of perfumed oil, the play of lamplight on bronze cups, and the mingling of power, politics, and pleasure. Along the way, we will discover how such events were woven into the social fabric, their rules and rituals far more intricate than the crude caricatures often painted by time. Our path will be gentle, like walking through a garden at dusk, where each step reveals a fragment of an old mosaic, and the air hums with ancient secrets. To understand these gatherings, we must first step into the city as it was, alive with the clang of craftsmen's hammers, the cries of street vendors, the scent of baking bread drifting over narrow alleys. It was an empire's heart, and at its core, the domus of the wealthy were worlds apart from the noise outside. Approaching one of these houses after sundown, the visitor would find the doorways framed by tall columns, guarded by silent slaves with eyes lowered. Inside, the atrium opened to the night sky, where water shimmered in the central pool, and the first notes of music floated from deeper within. An invitation to such an evening was never casual. It was both a privilege and a signal, one's social standing affirmed by the mere fact of being summoned. The guest list was carefully chosen, not only for companionship, but for political advantage, for each guest could be a patron, an ally, or a threat. This was not the chaos of a tavern, nor the public spectacle of the arena. Here, intimacy was power, and power was always intentional. The triclinium, or dining room, was where the gathering began, for Romans believed that pleasure and conversation flowed best when the body was at ease. Low couches were arranged around tables laden with delicacies, figs split to reveal their crimson hearts, olives gleaming like onyx, honey cakes dusted with spice. Wine, often diluted and perfumed, filled tall cups of silver or glass, its surface catching the glow of oil lamps. The host would recline among the guests, offering warmth and familiarity, but also assessing, measuring who laughed most easily, who leaned in to whisper, who kept a careful distance. Contrary to modern imaginings, not every such evening dissolved into unrestrained indulgence. Often the pace was unhurried, the pleasures layered. There might be poetry recited in a low voice, the words rippling through the room like a quiet current. A musician's fingers might coax gentle melodies from a lyre, filling the air with a texture as rich as the silks draped over the couches. It was here, in the dim light and mingled fragrances, that barriers between strangers could soften, where the first tendrils of intrigue could take root. The atmosphere was its own kind of intoxication. Lamps with bronze or terracotta bodies cast warm halos, while shadows clung in the corners like silent spectators. The smell of burning myrrh and frankincense curled through the air, mingling with the aroma of roasted meats and sweet fruits. Guests adorned in garments of deep crimson or pale ivory lay draped in attitudes of languid comfort, their hair scented with oil, their wrists encircled by bracelets that caught the lamplight. Conversation was as much a performance as the music, delicate, measured, often laced with double meanings. For some, the true allure of these evenings was not the immediate act of pleasure, but the dance leading to it. The game of glances across the table, the brushing of hands as a cup was passed, the subtle testing of boundaries. In Rome, seduction was often a matter of art and wit, a display of intellect as much as of beauty. A well-timed compliment or an artful anecdote could be more potent than any physical touch. Those unacquainted with Roman society might imagine that such gatherings ignored decorum entirely. But in truth, they followed unspoken codes. To rush was considered crude. To display too much eagerness was a mark of the unrefined. The evening's rhythm unfolded slowly, like a piece of music building towards a hidden refrain. The host orchestrated it with care, directing the flow of wine, choosing when to introduce a new performer, when to draw the curtains tighter against the cool night air. Some gatherings remained within the realm of conversation, music, and feasting, sending guests home flushed with wine and the pleasant ache of anticipation. Others shifted into more intimate spaces, courtyards scented with night-blooming flowers, private rooms where the lamplight was softer and the silence deeper. Yet even then, the event was not a chaotic revel, but a choreography, a weaving together of desire, power, and mutual benefit. To modern eyes, this blend of calculated elegance and sensuality may seem unusual, but for the Romans it was simply another expression of their worldview. That pleasure, like politics, was best conducted with forethought, ceremony, and an appreciation for beauty. Whether one attended as a nobleman seeking alliances, a poet hoping for patronage, or a courtesan displaying wit and charm, the gathering was a stage, and every gesture, every smile, a carefully chosen line in an unwritten play. As the evening deepened, the music might slow, the wine might be poured less often but in finer vessels, and the conversations would become quieter, more personal. Eyes met across the shadows. A hand rested a little longer than before on a neighbor's arm. The cool marble beneath bare feet contrasted with the warmth of the air, rich with scents and murmurs. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued its clamor. But here, within the host's domus, time seemed to loosen its grip, and the night became a thing to be savored, one lingering heartbeat at a time. It is in these first moments, before the evening turns toward its private chapters, that the essence of such gatherings is most clearly felt. Not in the act itself, but in the promise. The quiet recognition passing between guests, the tension of the unsaid, the shared awareness that the night still holds its secrets close. This, perhaps, was the true art of Rome's intimate assemblies, not merely indulgence, but the mastery of anticipation. Beyond the triclinium, the air shifted subtly, as though one had stepped through an invisible curtain into another realm of the evening. The laughter here was lower, the movement slower, the conversations punctuated by silences that spoke louder than words. Lamps were fewer, and their flames trembled against the polished surfaces of bronze mirrors hung along the walls, multiplying the glow until it seemed the room itself breathed with a quiet warmth. Servants moved silently, carrying shallow trays of pomegranates split into crimson petals, or small bowls of almonds dusted with salt. Others offered warm cloths scented with rose water for guests to refresh their hands before entering the inner spaces. In Roman culture, the transition from the public feast to the more secluded quarters was marked by such gestures, deliberate, unhurried, a reminder that one was stepping into a different layer of the night. These inner rooms often opened onto peristyles, courtyards framed by slender columns, where the moonlight lay across the paving stones in silver rectangles. Here, the air was touched by the cool breath of fountains, their murmuring water a soft counterpoint to the music that drifted faintly from the dining chamber. Garden beds, carefully tended, offered the scent of lilies and night-blooming jasmine, while in the shadows, statues of gods and heroes kept silent watch over the gathering. A guest might pause here, resting on a stone bench to listen to a companion's voice, or to let a stranger's glance linger. This was the place where conversations shed their earlier formality, where words might stray into the personal, the suggestive, or even the philosophical. Roman thought, after all, did not sharply divide the pleasures of the mind from those of the body. To speak of beauty in art could easily lead to speaking of beauty in the flesh, and from there to the more private exchanges that such gatherings were known for. The host, though rarely intrusive, guided this unfolding with the care of a sculptor. A subtle nod could send a servant to refill a guest's cup at precisely the right moment. A quiet remark could bring two guests into each other's company, as though by accident. The aim was not to force the evening's progress, but to shape it gently, ensuring that no one felt hurried, and yet the current always moved forward. In these spaces, the senses were gently coaxed into heightened awareness. Low tables held shallow dishes of dates stuffed with honeyed nuts, whose sweetness lingered on the tongue. Fine fabrics hung along the walls, their weaves so delicate that they shifted with the faintest breeze. Somewhere, a musician played a water organ, its notes echoing like a memory half remembered. Even the floor beneath one's feet, mosaics depicting scenes of gods reclining or lovers entwined, was part of the experience, each step reminding guests that they were surrounded by stories older than their own. It was also in these moments that one could most clearly see the variety of people such evenings drew together. There might be a senator whose words in the forum carried weight enough to sway laws, now leaning in to hear a poet speak of the sea. A merchant's wife, her eyes lined with coal, might share a laugh with a young philosopher whose tunic was worn but clean. Freedmen, whose fortunes had risen through clever trade, mingled with those whose lineage traced back to Rome's earliest days. Here, titles and wealth were tools, but not the only currency. Wit, charm, and beauty had their own measure of worth. Not all who attended sought the same pleasures. For some, these gatherings were occasions to form alliances, to gauge rivals, to secure favors through subtle promises. For others, they were escapes from the rigid patterns of public life, a chance to be seen and desired without the harsh light of scrutiny, and for a few, they were simply an indulgence in beauty for its own sake. The music, the food, the touch of a cool marble column beneath warm fingers. As the night deepened, the edges between these purposes began to blur. A conversation that began with trade routes along the Nile might end with the exchange of a private token. A debate on Virgil's verses might dissolve into shared laughter and a hand resting lightly on a forearm. These were the threads from which the night's tapestry was woven, each strand catching the lamplight differently, each binding guests together in ways that might last only until dawn or linger for years. In some peristyles, secluded alcoves awaited behind heavy drapes or through narrow archways. These were not hidden in shame, but simply removed from the hum of the larger company, offering those who wished it a quieter place to speak, or not speak at all. The walls here were often painted with soft scenes, lovers in a meadow, a satyr offering wine to a reclining nymph, the god Eros poised with his bow. The scent of incense was thicker, the air warmer from the closeness of the space, the light dim enough to erase the finer details of a face, while leaving the shape of a smile. The Romans, in their layered understanding of pleasure, knew that the evening's success was not measured by its final moments alone, but by the journey taken to reach them. The art lay in making each stage of the night feel complete in itself, so that a guest might leave after a single shared song or linger until the stars faded, yet still carry the memory as something whole. Outside, the city slept in uneven patches, some streets hushed, others still alive with gamblers, lovers, and thieves. But within the domus, the night was an enclosed world, sealed away from the chaos, devoted to the weaving of connections that, for a few hours, seemed untouched by time. And in the quiet spaces between music and laughter, in the measured brush of silk against skin, there was a sense that here, in the heart of Rome, the night itself was a kind of temple, and every gesture a small act of devotion to the art of living. Deeper still within the domus, past the peristyle where moonlight mingled with the trickle of fountains, lay the more private chambers. Here, the architecture itself seemed to conspire with the night. Doorways were narrow, encouraging guests to pass close together. Ceilings arched low enough to soften sound, so that voices became hushed without conscious effort. The air was warmer, rich with the scent of oil lamps and the faint trace of cinnamon and myrrh. These rooms were not meant for large gatherings, but for smaller constellations of guests, 3 or 4 gathered around a low table, or 2 reclining upon a single couch. The furniture was simple in form, yet lavish in detail. Cushions embroidered with golden thread, inlaid ivory boxes holding small ivory dice, or polished bone counters for games of chance. A dish of peeled grapes sat beside a pitcher of dark wine, its surface flecked with floating petals. Here, time seemed to loosen further. Guests no longer worried over how their words might be carried beyond the room. Instead, conversation unfurled at an unhurried pace, touching on memory, longing, or idle imaginings. One guest might speak of a journey to the eastern provinces where the temples rose from cliffs of red stone. Another might tell of a dream in which the Tiber flowed backward under a sky of pale gold. In these exchanges, reality and invention braided together, until it mattered less whether the story was true than whether it was beautiful. The Romans valued this blending of truth and art. To speak with grace was itself a form of offering, and a tale told well could be as intimate as the brush of a hand across the cheek. Listeners reclined with eyes half closed, letting the cadence of a voice sink into them like warm water. Sometimes a reply came not in words, but in a smile, a faint nod, a shared silence that needed no explanation. Between conversations, Music still threaded its way through the rooms, though here it was softer, perhaps the plucking of a cithara's strings or the faint sound of pipes drifting in from the peristyle. Shadows deepened in the folds of curtains, and the flicker of lamp flames made jewelry glint like sudden sparks. The host, though seldom present in these smaller spaces, had chosen every detail to create an atmosphere of gentle abundance, where the senses were never overwhelmed yet always engaged. The art of touch in such settings was as considered as the art of speech. A hand resting on another's forearm might remain there just long enough to suggest interest, then withdraw to let the absence speak for itself. A knee might brush against another's, seemingly by chance, yet repeated once more so the message was clear. These were movements slow enough to be denied if unwelcome, yet certain enough to be pursued if returned. Wine, always flowing yet never forced, played its part as well. It softened the voice, warmed the skin, blurred the edges of hesitation. Cups were refilled before they were quite empty, the act itself becoming a gesture of attention, almost of care. The Romans diluted their wine not to lessen its pleasure, but to prolong it, ensuring that the night's rhythm was steady, rather than rushed toward an end. For those whose eyes wandered toward the painted walls, there was much to read. Frescoes often depicted the myths of love and desire, Venus rising from the sea, her hair veiling her shoulders, Mars and Venus entwined, while the sun god Helios looked on in amused betrayal, satyrs chasing nymphs through painted groves. These images served as both decoration and unspoken suggestion, an invitation to see oneself reflected in the timeless stories. In one corner of such a room, a small brazier burned, sending a ribbon of fragrant smoke toward the ceiling. The scent shifted subtly as different herbs and resins were added, first sweet, then sharp, then earthy, so that time could be marked not by the passing of hours, but by the changing of the air. To a guest lying back against the cushions, eyes half closed, the effect was dreamlike. The world beyond the domus fading into irrelevance, the senses guided gently along the path the host had laid out. And still, beneath the surface of ease, there was the hum of intent. Some sought more than conversation, others guarded themselves even as they smiled. A whispered remark might carry the weight of a future promise, or the seed of a bargain to be made in daylight. In Rome, even the softest moments could ripple into politics or patronage, and those skilled in navigating such waters knew how to let desire and ambition walk hand in hand. It was often in these inner chambers that bonds were formed, which later shaped the fortunes of households. A merchant might secure the interest of a senator's nephew through a shared night's confidences. A poet might earn the patronage of a wealthy widow whose appreciation for verse deepened into something warmer. A foreign envoy might learn more in one evening's murmured conversation than weeks of formal negotiation could provide. Yet for many, what remained most vivid was not the game, but the atmosphere itself. The play of light and shadow across a beloved face, the weight of a shared glance that lingered longer than propriety allowed, the sound of laughter low enough to be felt more than heard. These were the moments that stayed long after the night ended, carried like a perfume clinging faintly to the skin. And so, as the hours slipped by unnoticed, the rooms of the domus became their own small universe, bound not by the turning of the city's clocks, but by the pulse of its guests. Outside, the watchman's calls marked the deepening night. Inside, the only measure of time was the slow unfurling of warmth, conversation, and the delicate threads of connection spun between strangers who for a few hours seemed to know each other as if they had met in another life. In certain houses, the innermost rooms were arranged so that the path to them was not straight but curved, a gentle winding through narrow passages lit only by small wall lamps. This design was no accident. It allowed guests to leave behind, step by step, the energy of the feast and the murmur of the peristyle. By the time one reached these chambers, the outside world felt very far away. The floors here were often covered with thick woven rugs from the eastern provinces, their dyes deep and rich, saffron, indigo, pomegranate red. They muted footsteps and gave a sense of warmth beneath bare feet. Low couches were placed close to one another, their cushions heaped in inviting disarray. On small tables stood trays of candied fruits and tiny pastries filled with spiced nuts, alongside cups of honey-sweetened wine. The scent in the air was heavier now, sandalwood and warmed amber, faintly resinous, a fragrance that seemed to slow the breath. In such rooms, the conversation changed once more. It grew more intimate, sometimes quieter, as if the very walls invited secrets. Stories were told here that would not be spoken in the open courtyard. Confessions of private desires, admissions of envy or longing, or the recollection of an encounter too fleeting to have been shared before. The Romans understood that words in such a setting could have a power almost physical, shaping the course of the evening as surely as touch. The host, if present, rarely dominated these moments. Instead, they became an unobtrusive figure, listening, offering a refill, ensuring the temperature of the room was just cool enough to encourage closeness without discomfort. This subtle management was the mark of true sophistication, the ability to create an environment where guests felt not only at ease, but subtly guided toward experiences they might not have sought alone. For those who wished it, music could be summoned, never too loud, and chosen for its tone rather than its skill alone. A single flute might breathe a melody that curled lazily in the air, or a lyre might be plucked with deliberate slowness, each note given space to fade before the next appeared. Sometimes the music was almost imperceptible, so that only when it stopped did one realize it had been there at all. The interplay of sight was as important as that of sound. Lamps were arranged so that light fell gently across faces, but left the corners in shadow. A flicker of movement there might catch the eye, a hand adjusting a garment, a head leaning close to another. Guests watched and were watched, and part of the pleasure lay in knowing this without needing to speak of it. Some of the most skillful players in these gatherings were those who could hold another's gaze for just the right length of time, neither too long nor too brief, so that it lingered afterward like the aftertaste of good wine. A look could serve as an invitation, a challenge, or a promise, and in Rome's private rooms, such exchanges carried as much meaning as any physical act. The sharing of food here was almost ceremonial. A fig offered from one hand to another was not merely a snack, but a gesture of intimacy. To accept it, to let fingers brush, was to acknowledge a connection. To decline was its own kind of statement, understood without offense but rarely without consequence. In a culture where hospitality and alliance were intertwined, these small acts were as deliberate as any political maneuver. And though desire was often a guest at these gatherings, it was never the only one. Ambition, curiosity, rivalry, and the simple love of beauty all sat side by side. One might lean in for a whispered question about the Senate's latest debate, then drift into a discussion of the most exquisite marble used in a new temple. The transitions between such subjects were seamless, as though the mind and the senses moved together without boundaries. There were moments when the air seemed to still, as if the night held its breath. Perhaps a performer recited a short verse, something brief but so perfectly chosen that all talk paused. Perhaps two guests began a dance, slow and deliberate, not for spectacle but for the quiet pleasure of movement. In those pauses, the atmosphere deepened, and the room seemed to close in more tightly around its guests, drawing them together. Beyond these chambers, still deeper in the domus, some hosts kept even more secluded rooms, rarely shown except to a chosen few. These were not places for many eyes, but for encounters stripped of all formality. The entrance might be veiled by a heavy curtain embroidered with mythic scenes, Ariadne sleeping as Bacchus approaches, or Selene descending to the mortal Endymion. To pass through such a curtain was to step fully into the private heart of the evening. Yet even for those who never crossed that threshold, the journey through the house was itself an experience. The gradual layering of scents, the shifting textures underfoot, the softening of sound, the narrowing of light, all combined to create a sense of passage, not just through space, but into another way of being. Guests emerged changed, as though the night had drawn some hidden part of themselves into the open, and for a while allowed it to breathe freely. In this way, the Roman gathering was never only about what could be seen or touched. It was about crafting an entire world within the walls of a single house, a world where each step led deeper into the weaving of connection, and where the most lasting impressions might be the quietest ones. In the fifth hour of the night, the domus had taken on a rhythm all its own. The sounds from the outer rooms were now no more than a distant hum, like the memory of a festival long past. Here, in the innermost spaces, the guests moved with a kind of unspoken accord, as if the air itself guided their steps. The walls were painted in deep, warm tones, ochre, crimson, and muted gold, colors that softened in the lamplight to something almost like the glow of embers. On these walls, scenes from mythology unfolded in silent dialogue. Persephone in a meadow of flowers, her hand just touching the edge of Hades' cloak. The goddess Flora scattering petals over the earth. These images were not chosen at random, for each carried layers of meaning, hints and parallels to the night's unfolding stories. Couches were arranged so that the lines between private and public space were blurred. One might recline at the edge of a group, close enough to join in laughter, but far enough to turn away into quieter conversation if desired. The air was thick with scents, clove, rose oil, the faint sweetness of wine-warmed figs. A gentle haze of incense drifted upward, curling toward the ceiling in slow spirals that made the very air seem languid. This was the hour when voices grew lower, but not necessarily softer. Some spoke in close murmurs, words meant only for the ears of one or two. Others let their laughter spill more freely, a little looser under the influence of wine and the comfort of the setting. The edges of formality, though not discarded, had softened to the point where a guest could rest an arm along the back of a couch without it being seen as a breach of manners. Servants continued to pass through, unobtrusive but ever attentive. They replenished wine without asking, replaced cool dishes with fresh ones, and adjusted the position of lamps so that light fell more pleasingly on certain faces. Their quiet efficiency was part of the invisible machinery that made the evening flow without interruption. The Romans had an art for making the senses collaborate. A bowl of warm almonds might be offered just as a poet began a recitation, so that taste and hearing mingled in the memory. A thread of music from the peristyle might reach the room just as two guests' eyes met across the lamplight, the moment fixed more firmly because it was wrapped in sound. Even the cooling of the air, as night deepened, was anticipated. Blankets of fine wool folded nearby for those who wished to draw them close. In these later hours, the conversation sometimes took on a playful, competitive edge. Guests might trade clever riddles or attempt to outdo each other with verses composed on the spot. A sharp-witted reply could earn a glance of admiration more potent than any physical touch. The skill of conversation was a prized form of allure in Rome, for it could be displayed openly in a way that physical affection could not always be. Yet alongside wit came the slower language of gestures. A hand might linger on a shoulder, a heartbeat too long. A shared cup might be drunk from without being wiped clean, the warmth of another's skin transferred through the thin linen of a tunic. These were not accidents, but the deliberate movements of a culture that prized suggestion over declaration. Some guests began toward the smaller, more secluded corners of the chamber, alcoves partially screened by hanging fabrics, or niches in the wall where the flicker of a single lamp created an island of light. There, conversation could be reduced to murmurs or abandoned altogether, replaced by the quiet companionship of shared space. Others stayed where they were, content to simply observe. For them, the beauty of the evening lay not in private exchanges, but in the harmony of the whole, the way light and shadow played over the painted walls, the rise and fall of music, the shifting currents of human connection. To watch such a scene unfold was to witness a living tapestry, each thread moving with purpose, yet all part of a larger design. And always, there was the sense that the night itself was the true host. Time seemed to bend within these walls, the hours slipping past unnoticed. The city beyond might be stirring with other kinds of life, gamblers in the Subura, sailors in the port, lovers meeting under arches. But here the boundaries of the world had been drawn more narrowly. Within them, every glance, every word, every touch felt magnified. The Romans understood that such evenings were not simply diversions. They were acts of cultivation, tending the garden of one's social and political life as carefully as a vine grower tends his grapes. Friendships could be strengthened, debts subtly created, rivalries softened or sharpened through nothing more than the arrangement of a room and the sequence of a night. By this stage, those who had been strangers at the beginning often found themselves speaking as if to an old acquaintance. Shared cups, shared laughter, shared silences. These were the threads that rewove relationships under the quiet cover of the night. And though no formal agreements were signed here, the choices made in these rooms could ripple outward into the daylight, altering the course of fortunes and alliances alike. The hour was late now, but the evening was far from finished. The wine continued to flow, the music found new shapes, and somewhere, behind the heavy curtains at the far end of the chamber, the most private spaces of the domus waited, still holding their mysteries in the softened glow of lamplight. In the 6th hour, the domus felt almost like a dream, each room flowing into the next as if no true walls divided them. The spaces had grown quieter, yet the quiet was not absence but fullness, the way a deep pool holds more weight than a rushing stream. Guests moved more slowly now, their gestures unhurried, their voices softened into a kind of nocturnal intimacy. The inner lamps burned lower, their oil carefully tended so the light would last until dawn. Shadows moved like a second set of guests, silent, stretching and shrinking across the mosaics underfoot. The patterns there, vine leaves curling into one another, dolphins diving among waves, small birds pecking at bunches of grapes, seemed to echo the night's mood, a mingling of pleasure, abundance, and the quiet suggestion of movement beneath stillness. Those who remained in the main inner chamber reclined with greater ease than before, no longer poised as they had been at the start of the evening. Tunics had loosened at the shoulders, sandals had been set aside, and even hairpins had been slipped free so that a curl might fall forward over the cheek. Such small disarrangements did not suggest disorder, but a shedding of the day's armor, a surrender to the comfort of the moment. It was in these hours that stories began to lengthen, unspooling slowly in the lamp's glow. Some were personal histories, how a guest had once been rescued from a shipwreck off Massilia, or the strange customs seen in a distant province. Others were fragments of myth retold in new ways. Perseus not as the triumphant hero, but as a wanderer unsure of his own place. Circe not as a temptress, but as a lonely woman who turned men into beasts so they would stay near her. Such retellings carried no risk of censure here, for in the privacy of the domus, truth was a matter for the moment, not for the Senate. Sometimes the conversation paused altogether, giving way to a stillness that was not empty. Guests would simply watch one another, the silence filled with the soft sounds of shifting cushions, the faint chime of a bracelet as a hand moved, the distant trickle of water from the courtyard. A look held in such a pause could speak with more force than a long exchange of words. The food served now was lighter, more suited to the lateness of the hour, small slices of soft cheese, thin wafers drizzled with honey, chilled melon from a covered bowl. Wine, too, was poured more delicately. Its dilution increased so that its warmth would sustain without tipping into excess. The Romans prized endurance in their pleasures. A night that collapsed into chaos was considered clumsy, lacking the grace that true refinement demanded. In the more secluded alcoves, the distance between guests had narrowed. Some sat close enough that their voices could not be overheard, their heads inclined together in the space between lamp and shadow. Others leaned back, eyes half-lidded, listening with the faintest smile to a story told just for them. Here, the unspoken was often as deliberate as the spoken, the pause before a reply, the way a hand rested idle yet within reach, the momentary glance toward a curtain that marked an even more private room beyond. The host's influence was still felt, though they might not have been seen for some time. A fresh scattering of rose petals might appear on a low table. A new lamp might replace one that had burned low, its light subtly shifting the focus of the room. Even absence could be a kind of presence, for the guests knew they were still within the frame of a carefully composed night. Beyond these rooms, the city's own night was thinning. The watchmen had changed shifts, their calls echoing faintly through the streets. Somewhere in the distance, the first vendors preparing bread for the morning market might be stirring their fires. Yet here, the hour seemed suspended. The domus was a sealed vessel, holding its warmth and its secrets until its host decided to release them. A guest might find themselves tracing the rim of their wine cup without realizing it, caught in thought, or in the gaze of another. The touch of fabric against the skin seemed softer now, the air warmer, the sounds closer. Time was measured in these small sensations, the slow cooling of a lamp's bronze body, the sweet salt taste of an olive, the faint shift in another's breathing. For those who had not yet ventured into the deepest rooms, the thought of them might be quietly present. The heavy curtains at the far end of the corridor no longer seemed like barriers, but invitations. They hung in stillness, their embroidered figures, nymphs, satyrs, reclining gods, frozen as though in mid-glance toward whoever approached. To cross beyond them was not a requirement of the night, but it was understood that within lay the most private and carefully guarded spaces where the evening's slow current could deepen further. Yet whether one remained in the outer inner rooms or slipped into those hidden chambers, the sense of belonging was the same. Here, under the tender governance of lamplight and careful design, the night unfolded not in haste, but in a patient flowering, petal by petal, layer by layer, until even the smallest gesture seemed part of a larger, unspoken design. In the seventh hour, the night had grown dense and golden, as if the air itself were steeped in wine. Every sound seemed to carry more slowly. Every movement took on the softness of something seen through silk. The domus no longer felt like a place within the city, but like a separate world, one that had always existed, waiting for these particular guests to step inside it. The corridors leading toward the most secluded chambers were lit only by small lamps fixed in niches, their flames barely touching the floor. Between them stretched pockets of shadow where a figure could linger unseen, listening to a fragment of laughter or the murmur of two voices drawing close. The walls here bore more intimate paintings than those in the outer rooms, scenes not of heroes and gods in triumph, but of lovers caught in moments between action. A woman half turned toward her companion, her robe slipping from one shoulder, a youth reclining with an expression caught between thought and longing. The scent was richer now, less floral and more resinous, with notes of warmed amber and a faint trace of musk. It clung to the skin and hair, as though the night itself wished to leave its mark on those who passed through it. Cushions had been moved closer together, some to the point of overlapping, so that guests could recline side by side, sharing the same pillow or the same stretch of woven rug. Here words were often no longer necessary. A cup of wine passed between two hands could hold the entire meaning of an exchange. A knee brushing another's could be acknowledged with the smallest tilt of a smile. In these moments, the boundary between deliberate and accidental touch dissolved. Everything seemed both intended and inevitable. The music, too, had shifted. The lyre's strings were plucked more slowly now, each note allowed to fade into silence before the next began. A hand drum sounded only occasionally, its beat low and steady, like the slow pulse of the room itself. The musicians did not seek to entertain in the usual sense. Instead, they seemed to be shaping the air, giving form to the quiet. Some guests withdrew further still, disappearing behind curtains into smaller rooms whose contents were known only to those invited within. These were spaces where conversation gave way entirely to the tactile, where lamplight was dimmed almost to darkness, and where time dissolved into the measure of breath and heartbeat. For others, the alcoves and couches of the main chamber were intimacy enough, offering the warmth of proximity without the complete privacy of seclusion. The host's presence in this hour was a whisper rather than a voice. They might pass through once, their steps unhurried, laying a hand lightly on the shoulder of a guest in greeting before moving on. It was a reminder that the night's flow was still guided, even as it seemed to move of its own accord. A new jug of wine would appear on a table. A small dish of preserved dates, their skins wrinkled like soft leather, might be set down beside a reclining pair. Such gestures were not noticed in the moment, but remembered later when one tried to recall why the night had felt so seamless. The conversations that did continue often turned inward. Instead of stories or games, they became exchanges of confidences, things too small to matter in the forum, yet large enough to leave an imprint here. A memory of a first kiss under the arches of the Aqua Marcia, a confession of envy for a rival's skill with words, an admission that one had always feared the sea despite being born in a port city. These disclosures, whether truthful or not, created the illusion of closeness, and in the context of the night, illusion was as binding as reality. At intervals, laughter would rise from one corner of the room, drifting lazily across the space before settling again into quiet. It was not the loud, public laughter of banquets, but the softer kind that slips between two people like a shared secret. Even those not part of it might glance toward the sound and smile, recognizing the texture of a moment too private to intrude upon. The longer one stayed in such a setting, the more the senses rearranged themselves. Sight became less important than touch, touch less important than sound, and sound less important than scent. The faint salt of skin, the lingering sweetness of honey, the smoky breath of a lamp just before it was trimmed. The city outside, with its shouts, its carts, its restless tides of movement, felt impossibly far away. And yet beneath this stillness, something was always shifting. Connections formed and dissolved. Glances were returned or turned aside. Small choices made now would ripple outward into the daylight hours to come. But no one spoke of that. In the seventh hour, the night belonged entirely to itself, and to those who allowed themselves to be drawn into its slow, deliberate embrace. In the eighth hour, the night reached its deepest hue, a shade neither entirely dark nor fully warm, but something in between, a color of stillness. The walls of the inner chambers seemed to hold the quiet in place, as though the air would not dare to move too quickly and disturb the slow rhythm that had taken hold. The guests who remained were fewer now. Some had already departed into the cool streets, cloaked against the late hour, carrying with them a faint trace of incense on their skin. Those who stayed moved like figures in a painted frieze, every step unhurried, every turn of the head deliberate. The domus no longer hummed with the early chatter of arrival. It breathed in long, measured intervals, like a sleeper deep in a dream. In this hour, the light came almost entirely from low-standing lamps, their bronze bases warm to the touch. The flames were shielded by thin discs of horn, giving them a muted glow, so that shadows no longer fell sharply but blurred at the edges. Fabrics on couches and cushions appeared richer in this dimness, the folds deeper, the colors softer. Skin, too, seemed to take on a new texture, smooth, warm, and touched with gold. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt resins. Storax, with its honeyed undertones, had been added to the brazier, mingling with the earlier sweetness of rose and the dryness of myrtle. Each breath seemed slower, more deliberate, as if the lungs themselves were reluctant to break the spell. Even the wine had changed character. It was cooler now, served in smaller cups, a dark ribbon of flavor meant to linger rather than to flood the senses. Some guests reclined so close that the space between them was no more than the width of a finger. Words, if spoken, were given in a voice meant for one listener only. For others, the pleasure lay not in touch, but in the sustained act of looking, eyes meeting across the lamp's circle of light, breaking away only when the weight of the gaze became too much to hold. The musicians played only when asked, and then only a fragment, a verse, a slow sequence of chords. Music here was not background, but punctuation, a marker for moments too rich to pass in silence. The rest of the time, the sounds of the room were enough. The soft slide of fabric, the faint chime of a bangle, the almost inaudible crackle of resin in the brazier. The host had become a figure almost entirely unseen, yet their influence was in every detail. A bowl of pomegranate seeds appeared on a table, just as a conversation turned toward a memory of summer. A thin woolen wrap was offered to a guest whose bare shoulders caught a faint shiver. The servants moved with the same discretion, no longer refilling cups without invitation, but watching for the smallest glance that might signal a wish. For those in the smaller chambers, the night had narrowed to the space between themselves and one other. Curtains muffled the sounds from beyond, making the air feel private and closed. Here, touch became more deliberate, an ankle resting against a calf, a hand tracing the outline of another's palm. Sometimes the smallest gesture was the most consuming. The slow untangling of a knot in a silk sash could feel longer than a song. In the main inner room, the remaining guests formed little islands of stillness. Two leaned close, their heads almost touching as they spoke. Another lay back, eyes closed, not asleep, but drifting in the warmth and scent of the space. It was a scene that could not be hurried without breaking it, a delicate balance of presence and restraint. Beyond the walls, the city was nearing its quietest hour. The clatter of carts had faded entirely. replaced by the occasional footstep of a watchman or the far-off bark of a dog. In the Subura, perhaps, the last of the taverns still burned their lamps, but here, in this private house, the night was contained, suspended, and yet, for all its stillness, the 8th hour was not without movement. The threads spun earlier in the evening were being drawn together, some into knots, others into loose loops that might be pulled again on another night. It was the hour when glances became decisions, when the smallest nod might carry more weight than a long declaration. And it was the hour when the domus, in all its lamplit beauty, seemed less like a house and more like a vessel adrift on a very slow, very deep current, carrying everyone within it toward a shore they had not yet seen. In the 9th hour, the domus seemed to draw inward, as if even the walls had leaned closer to listen. The air was warmer now, not from the summer night beyond, but from the slow accumulation of breath, of bodies gathered together, of lamps burning steadily without interruption. Time had lost its ordinary shape. The boundaries between moments were as blurred as the softened shadows on the painted walls. The guests who remained were those unwilling to leave the current of the evening. They had settled into smaller groups, each its own small orbit, drifting just far enough from the others to create the illusion of privacy while still sharing the same pool of lamplight. The room smelled of wine and warm bronze, of faintly smoldering resin, and something more elusive. The mingled scent of skin and fabric and the faint trace of perfumes applied hours before now deepened into something personal. Conversation had become slower, yet not dull. Each word was chosen as though it might be the last of the night, and each pause was allowed to stretch until it turned into its own kind of speech. Some spoke of nothing, commenting on the way the lamp flame bent toward the draught from the courtyard, while others dared to speak of things that would have been left unsaid earlier. The true nature of a friendship, the real reason for a journey, the quiet longing for someone never named aloud. In the corners, gestures had grown more open. A hand might rest fully now on another's arm, fingers curling lightly in place. A shoulder might lean against another without the need for apology. These were not the hurried movements of appetite, but the slow, weightless touches of those who wish to remain in the present moment as long as possible. The night was not rushing toward anything. It was content to hold itself here, as though this hour were the center of all its meaning. The musicians had withdrawn entirely, their instruments set aside in shadow. The music now came from the natural sounds of the room, the faint creak of a couch as weight shifted, the slide of a jug across a table, the low hum of someone speaking too quietly for their words to be caught. This was music that belonged only to those who were there to hear it. The host appeared briefly, moving with ease of someone entirely at home in this hour. They spoke to no one in particular, yet their glance touched every guest in turn, as if to measure the state of the night without needing to ask. A tray of figs, their skins split to reveal dark crimson flesh, was placed on the central table, alongside a small dish of soft cheese. No one reached for them immediately. The offering was part of the scene, waiting for the moment when someone's hand would break its stillness. In one alcove, two guests sat so close their knees overlapped, their conversation no more than a whisper. In another, a pair reclined without speaking at all, eyes closed, hands loosely linked. Across the room, a group of three leaned over a small board game, their pieces moving with a slowness that made it clear the outcome was irrelevant. Beyond the curtains, the most private rooms waited, their silence more profound than any within the main chamber. Those who had entered them earlier might now emerge with the look of those returning from a long, slow journey. They rejoined the room without ceremony, slipping once more into the layered atmosphere as if it had never been left. Outside, the city was almost still. Even the night birds had quieted, and the Tiber's dark water slid past without a sound that could reach this high ground. The world beyond the domus felt distant enough to be imaginary, and in a way it was. The only reality here was the low circle of light, the warmth of human nearness, and the awareness that the night still held itself open. The 9th hour was not about beginnings or endings. It was the hour of suspension, when nothing needed to change because everything that mattered was already in motion, moving not toward a conclusion but deeper into itself. Within these walls, the smallest shift, a glance, a shared breath, was enough to ripple through the whole of the room, binding it together with invisible threads that would hold until the first hint of morning began to loosen them. In the 10th hour, the night had grown so still that even the sound of a cup being set down seemed to linger in the air long after it had touched the table. The domus felt heavier now, not with fatigue, but with the accumulated weight of glances, of words spoken slowly and deliberately, of the steady glow of lamps that had burned without interruption since the evening began. Only a handful of guests remained, their faces softened in the dim light. Some lay fully reclined, heads resting on cushions, eyes half-lidded as they listened to voices without needing to respond. Others leaned forward, elbows on knees, speaking in murmurs meant only for the space between themselves and the one who listened. The room seemed smaller than before, not because of its walls, but because the shared warmth had drawn everyone inward. The scent of the air had deepened once again. The resin on the brazier had shifted from storax to frankincense, carrying a drier, almost sacred note that curled faintly toward the ceiling. The sweetness of wine was still there, though it had become more like a memory than a taste, lingering at the back of the throat. Occasionally, a servant would slip in to replenish a bowl or adjust a lamp, but their presence was now so much a part of the rhythm that it barely stirred the surface of the room's calm. In one corner, two guests shared a single blanket, its folds gathered around their shoulders. They spoke rarely, yet their closeness made it clear that words were no longer necessary between them. Across the room, a man traced the rim of his cup as he listened to a woman tell a story about the first snowfall she had ever seen in a city far north where the air was so cold it made the skin ache. Her voice was slow, her words strung out like beads, and the others nearby listened as though each one might break if touched too quickly. The painted walls seemed to have grown more vivid in the low light. Figures of gods and mortals leaned toward each other in gestures that echoed those of the living guests. Hands brushing, eyes half closed, garments slipping to reveal the suggestion of skin. The flickering lamps made the figures seem to shift, as if the ancient paint still held the warmth of the moments it depicted. At the far end of the room, the curtains leading to the most private chambers stirred faintly in the drop. No one spoke of them now, though a few eyes lingered there between sentences, as if the mere thought of what lay beyond was enough to color the present moment. It was understood that to pass through them was not an escape from the night, but a deepening of it. For those who remained in the main room, the game was now in the smallest details. The decision to refill someone else's cup rather than one's own, the act of leaning closer not to speak, but simply to be near. A hand resting against a low table might inch forward until it touched another, then retreat with the faintest curl of a smile. These were gestures almost invisible to anyone not looking for them, yet in this hour, nothing passed unnoticed. The quiet was not absolute. From somewhere beyond the peristyle came the faint sound of water striking water, the courtyard fountain, still running as it had since the start of the evening. Its rhythm had become so much a part of the night that it was only in the pauses between words that it was heard again. It was steady, patient, and without urgency, much like the guests themselves. Beyond the walls, the city had fallen into its deepest sleep. Even the watchmen's calls were fewer now, as if they, too, felt the heaviness of this hour. The wind had shifted, carrying the faint coolness that signaled the approach of dawn, though it was still far enough away to be of no concern. Inside, the air was warm and enclosed, holding the night like a sealed vessel. The 10th hour was a place within the night where nothing felt separate. Past and present, host and guest, spoken and unspoken, all seemed to rest in the same stillness. Those who sat here knew they were part of something that could not be recreated in exactly the same way again. When it ended, it would dissolve completely, leaving only the faint scent of resin on their garments and the memory of a room where the hours moved more slowly than anywhere else in the world. In the 11th hour, the domus felt as though it were breathing in long, deep intervals. The air was thick and close, carrying the warmth of bodies that had not moved far from one another for many hours. Lamps still burned, but their oil was lower now, and the flames wavered more visibly, sending shadows to sway across the painted walls. The light softened every edge, making faces appear calmer, eyes darker, gestures slower. Only a few voices remained in the air at any given moment. Some guests had retreated entirely into silence, watching the others as one might watch the last embers of a fire, knowing they could burn low at any time. Those who spoke did so with pauses so long that the listener might think the thought had been abandoned, only to find the sentence continuing as if no time had passed. The brazier had been fed with a final handful of crushed herbs, bay leaves, and small chips of cedar, so that the smoke now carried a green, almost forest-like scent beneath the lingering sweetness of earlier resins. It mixed with the faint salt of perspiration, the lingering perfume from earlier hours, the scent of wine evaporating slowly from half-emptied cups. Couches were no longer neatly arranged. They had shifted slightly as guests leaned closer to one another or reclined at new angles. Cushions were rumpled, blankets had slipped to the floor, and sandals lay forgotten beneath low tables. The deliberate order of the night's early hours had given way to the quiet disarray of comfort. One guest traced shapes in the condensation on a silver cup, her fingers moving slowly over the cool metal. Another leaned against a column, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as if following the slow drift of smoke toward the high beams. In one corner, two men sat shoulder to shoulder, speaking so quietly that their words were swallowed almost immediately by the air between them. The curtains leading to the innermost rooms no longer moved. Whatever draught had stirred them earlier was gone. Their stillness seemed deliberate, as though the space beyond was now fully claimed by those who had chosen it, its threshold no longer inviting but guarding. For those who remained outside, there was no sense of exclusion, only the knowledge that the night had unfolded differently for each of them, and that no single experience could hold it all. Servants moved more rarely now, their duties nearly complete. They poured wine only when asked, refilled plates without the constant vigilance of earlier hours, and often stood just inside the door, still and unobtrusive, as though they too were caught in the suspended air of the room. Even the fountain in the courtyard seemed quieter, though it still sent its silver sound faintly through the corridors. The painted figures on the walls seemed to lean closer in the unsteady light. Venus reached for Mars with a softer gaze than she had at the evening's start. Apollo's lyre looked as though it might actually be vibrating under his hand. The shadows made them seem alive, as if they too had been drawn into the night's slow unwinding. From time to time, a burst of laughter would break through, surprising in its clarity, before fading back into the hum of low voices. It was never the loud, sharp laughter of mockery, but something round and warm, the kind that comes when tiredness and contentment blend. Beyond the domus, the first signs of the coming day were beginning to stir in the farthest reaches of the city. Somewhere in the forum, an early vendor might be arranging baskets of herbs, and in the port district, the ropes of moored ships creaked in the changing tide. But here, those signs had not yet crossed the walls. The domus still held its own time, and that time had slowed to almost nothing. The 11th hour was not about reaching an end. It was about deep rest, about the moment when one realizes there is nothing more to seek within the night because everything is already present. The few who remained in the lamplit chamber were part of something fragile, a web of glances and shared stillness that would dissolve at the faintest disturbance. But for now it held, swaying gently in the quiet air, like the flame of a lamp that has burned all night and still refuses to go out. In the 12th hour, the domus had become a place of near complete stillness, as if it were floating in its own pocket of time. The walls, the lamps, the painted figures, even the very air seemed reluctant to move. What remained of the night was not measured by the hours, but by the quiet persistence of warmth, of scent, of the low murmur of voices that spoke as though they had always been here. The number of guests had thinned to only a handful. They were arranged in loose clusters rather than fixed seats, their positions shifting subtly as the hours passed. Some reclined entirely, lying back with eyes half shut, speaking only when something worth the effort came to mind. Others leaned forward, hands resting on knees, voices lowered until they were almost indistinguishable from the soft hiss of the lamps. The brazier's glow was faint now, its embers hidden under a layer of ash, yet every so often a small orange thread would flare into view, sending up a wisp of cedar-scented smoke. The fragrance was no longer strong. It had settled into the fabrics, into the hair and clothing of the guests, into the walls themselves. It was a part of the room now, inseparable from it. Wine cups were left half full on the low tables, the liquid inside catching the faintest flicker of light when someone shifted. No one drank quickly anymore. Each sip was a slow thing, savored as much for its warmth as for its taste. The platters of fruit and cheese had been pushed aside or forgotten entirely, the offerings of earlier hours replaced by the quiet satisfaction of having had enough. The floor, with its intricate mosaics, was partly hidden beneath the folds of blankets and cushions that had slipped from couches. A few guests sat directly on them, their backs against the low walls, speaking in tones that barely disturbed the air. The conversation had changed in nature. There were no more debates, no recitations, no clever exchanges meant to impress. What passed between them now was unpolished and simple. A memory, a thought spoken aloud without weighing its effect, a question asked only because someone nearby might know the answer. In one corner, a woman had fallen into a light sleep, her head resting against the arm of the man beside her. He did not move to wake her, but let her breathing set the pace for his own, as if the night's quiet was anchored to that slow rhythm. Across the room, two others sat so close their foreheads nearly touched, their words no longer carrying to anyone else if they were speaking at all. The curtains to the innermost rooms remained closed, but their embroidered scenes seemed to have softened in the dimness. Bacchus, reclining among his followers, no longer looked as though he were inviting anyone forward, but rather as if he had settled into his own deep rest, satisfied with the revel he had already overseen. The servants had withdrawn almost completely. Now and then one would appear in the doorway, glance at the room, and leave without a sound. The absence of movement beyond the guests themselves added to the feeling that the domus was a sealed vessel, afloat in the dark hours before dawn. Outside, the city's first breath of morning was drawing closer. A pale, this cold current of air moved through the streets, bringing with it the faint scent of river water. The sound of a lone cartwheel could be heard somewhere far off, but it came like an echo from another world. Inside, the air remained warm, carrying the layered fragrances of everything the night had been. The 12th hour was a place of surrender. The night no longer sought to charm, to impress, to tempt. It had shed all ornament and revealed only its quiet core. Those still awake felt no urgency to rise, no thought of departure yet. They were bound together by nothing more than shared presence, and in that presence there was a depth that no music, no display, no performance could create. It was the bare, unshaped truth of the night, a slow, steady hum that would fade only when the first light crept over the roofs outside. In the 13th hour, the night had entered its most fragile state, as if one more breath might shatter it. The lamps were burning low, their flames no longer steady but quivering with the faintest drafts. Shadows reached further across the walls now, swallowing some of the painted figures entirely, while others emerged more vividly than before, their expressions altered by the wavering light. Only a very few guests remained. They were no longer arranged as separate groups, but had drawn closer together, as though by instinct, forming a small circle of warmth in the middle of the room. Around them, the domus seemed to recede into darkness, its outer chambers quiet and still, the distant peristyle no longer sending any echo of water into the air. The brazier was little more than a bed of embers, but each time a guest shifted, the ash stirred faintly, and a small glow brightened, sending up a brief breath of cedar smoke. It mingled with the scent of wine and the faint, almost imperceptible trace of myrrh that had been burned hours ago, lingering as a ghost in the air. Couches had been abandoned in favor of the floor, where cushions and blankets formed a low nest in the center of the chamber. Here, people leaned against one another, not out of boldness, but out of the simple comfort that came from shared warmth. There was little conversation now. Instead, there were fragments, half sentences that trailed into silence, questions that went unanswered because no answer was needed. One man idly twisted the fringe of a blanket between his fingers, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. A woman beside him hummed something so quietly that it might have been mistaken for the sound of breathing. Across from them, another guest rested her chin in her hands, her eyes closing between each few words she spoke. The night no longer encouraged energy, it cradled stillness. The curtains to the private rooms hung untouched. Whatever had occurred there earlier was now finished, their spaces surrendered to the dark. Even the embroidered figures on the fabric seemed to have closed their eyes. Bacchus no longer reclined in invitation but in deep slumber. Venus's gaze had softened into something like contentment. The servants had withdrawn entirely. The trays of food and wine had been left where they were, the cups no longer refilled. There was no need. No one was reaching for them. All that remained was the occasional movement of a hand to shift a cushion or draw a blanket closer. From outside, a faint change in the air marked the slow approach of dawn. The night's earlier warmth had thinned, replaced by a coolness that carried with it the scent of stone and distant water. Somewhere far off, perhaps in the forum or along the river's edge, the first voices of early workers could be imagined, though none of them truly reached this place. The walls still held the quiet intact. The 13th hour had no ceremony, no signal to mark its arrival. It was a slow unspooling, the unwinding of the night's intricate weave until only its plainest, most essential threads remained. Those who lingered did so not because of anything left to say or do, but because to rise now would feel like breaking a fragile seal. The night had given all it had to give, and what was left was something softer than memory, a presence, warm and weightless, that would dissolve the moment anyone stepped beyond the lamplight. In the 14th hour, the domus felt like the last ember in a hearth, small, steady, and deeply alive in its quiet. The air was thick with the weight of hours already lived, each one layered upon the other, until the room seemed almost to sway with the memory of its own fullness. No one moved unless they had to, and when they did, it was with a slowness that seemed less like weariness than reverence. The lamps had burned down to their final oil. Their light was no longer gold, but a deep amber orange, like the glow within the heart of a fruit. This dimness softened the outlines of everything, the curve of a shoulder beneath linen, the angle of a jaw in profile, the fine folds in the cushions scattered on the floor. The flames themselves fluttered as if they were aware of the hour, as if they knew they had nearly completed their work. Only 4 guests remained in the chamber. They sat close enough that a single blanket covered most of them, its wool warmed by the shared heat of their bodies. Their voices rose rarely, and when they did, it was to say things not for discussion, but for the sake of hearing the sound. A name spoken softly, a simple observation about the smell of the cedar smoke, a single line from a remembered poem. The brazier's embers were a low, steady red. When the air shifted, a faint crackle would come from within, and a single spark would leap upward before fading again. The scent had changed from the resinous sharpness of earlier hours to something gentler, the lingering warmth of wood that had been burning for a long time. At one side of the room, a woman lay with her head resting on a folded arm, eyes open but unfocused. Beside her, a man traced slow circles on the back of her hand with his fingertip. Across from them, another guest leaned against the wall, legs outstretched, watching the smoke curl and collapse above the brazier. It was not the gaze of someone waiting for anything to happen, but of someone content to watch what already was. The painted walls seemed to have retreated into shadow. Only fragments of the scenes remained visible, the curve of a lyre, the outline of a reclining figure, the shimmer of gold leaf where a lamp's flame happened to catch it. In this light, the myths became more like memories, half seen and half felt, blending with the night's own story until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. No servants entered now. Their absence was not neglect but recognition. There was nothing left to serve, nothing to replenish. The room had become self-contained, its guests sustained by the warmth, the quiet, and each other's nearness. Even the wine sat untouched, its surface catching the low light without being disturbed. Beyond the walls, the city's edges were beginning to brighten, though no one inside had yet seen it. The air pressing in from outside had cooled further, bringing with it a faint dampness from the river. A single bird had begun to sing somewhere in the distance, Not loudly, not insistently, but as if it were testing the sky. The sound drifted through the silence of the room, touching it without breaking it. The 14th hour was not the end, but it was the point where the night's great tapestry had been reduced to its final threads. The gatherings of earlier hours, the laughter, the music, the glances, the slow shaping of connections were all here, distilled into the shared breathing of those who remained. It was not joy nor longing, nor even rest. It was simply presence, unadorned and complete, held in the faint glow of lamps that would not last much longer. In the 15th hour, the domus seemed to balance on the very edge of night, like a breath held too long before release. The air was cool now, yet still clung to the sense of cedar smoke, warm linen, and the faint sweetness of fruit left untouched on the low tables. The light had dimmed to a fragile, trembling haze. Each lamp's flame looked as though it might vanish with the smallest movement of air, but none of the guests dared disturb it. Only 3 remained in the main chamber. They had drawn close without intention. Their seats angled toward one another, as if the room itself had guided them into a smaller circle. Words were rare now, and when they came, they sounded less like conversation than fragments carried on the tide of thought, unfinished, drifting, content to be left incomplete. One woman sat cross-legged on the floor, her hair loose over her shoulders, turning a pomegranate seed between her fingers without eating it. Beside her, a man leaned against a cushion, eyes half closed, tracing idle patterns on the fabric's edge. The third guest reclined with his head tilted back, gaze fixed somewhere above, following the slow drift of smoke curling into the rafters. Their stillness was not fatigue, but something quieter, as if they had reached the deepest layer of the night and found there was nowhere else to go. The painted walls were almost invisible now, their colors reduced to shadow and the faint glimmer of gold leaf where a lamp's light happened to fall. In the softened glow, the figures seemed to dissolve into the plaster, their stories folded back into silence. Even the embroidered curtains at the far end hung heavier, their once bright threads dulled in the dying light. The brazier's embers were nearly gone. Each faint collapse of ash sent a small sigh of warmth into the air, but no sparks rose now. The scent had shifted again, less cedar, more the faint mineral tang of cooled stone and metal. A single cup of wine remained on the nearest table, its surface unbroken, reflecting the lamps like tiny suns trapped in still water. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. Somewhere far away, a cart's wheels clattered briefly over uneven stones, and the sound of a gate's heavy bar being lifted rang into the morning air. The faintest blue had begun to touch the horizon, though here behind the thick walls, the light had not yet found its way in. The servants had long since vanished from sight. No footsteps echoed in the halls, no quiet rustle of fabric marked their presence. The guests were alone with the night, and the night was almost gone. Yet there was no urgency in them. They did not gather their cloaks or make for the door. They simply sat, as if prolonging this hour might keep dawn from finding them. In this moment, the house felt not like a host's dwelling, but like a living thing, holding them in its final, measured heartbeat before it let them go. The 15th hour was a threshold, not quite the night, not yet the morning, where nothing more needed to be said or done, and where the smallest sound, the smallest movement, felt enough to carry the weight of the entire night that had come before. In the 16th hour, the first pale strands of dawn had begun to thread their way into the city beyond, though the domus still held itself in shadow. The light outside was fragile, not yet strong enough to pierce the heavy curtains, but it carried with it a faint change in the air, a coolness that crept along the stone floors and curled beneath the blankets scattered across the chamber. The 3 remaining guests had shifted little since the last hour. They were gathered close to the brazier, though its glow had dimmed to a soft pulse beneath a thin crust of ash. No one bothered to stir it. The warmth it gave was slight, but it was enough. The scent of cedar and myrrh lingered faintly, mingling with the cool mineral smell that often comes just before daylight. Their voices were almost gone now, replaced by the occasional murmur or the smallest question answered with a nod. The night's earlier exchanges, the poetry, the teasing, the hidden invitations, had been burned down to embers just like the fire. What was left was something quieter, stripped of all pretense, the simple company of those who had stayed until the very last hours. One of them lay stretched across a low couch, head resting against the curve of his arm, eyes half closed as though watching something far away. Another sat on the floor with her back to the wall, knees drawn to her chest, her gaze fixed on the faint curl of smoke rising from the brazier. The third leaned against a cushion, watching the play of light on the wine cup in his hand without drinking from it. The painted walls had almost disappeared into darkness, but here and there, a glint of gold leaf still caught the lamplight, an earring on a painted goddess, the hilt of a hero's sword, the curve of a lyre. These were like fragments of memory, still clinging even as the rest of the image faded. The curtains leading to the most private rooms stirred faintly as a current of cooler air passed through, carrying with it a whisper of the world beyond. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of a market stall being opened reached their ears, faint but undeniable. The city was waking. Yet here, the domus resisted that call. The lamps, though low, still held enough light to keep the chamber apart from the morning. The shadows on the walls did not retreat, and the air was still warm enough to keep the three guests rooted in place. No servants appeared, and no one seemed to expect them. There was nothing left to bring, nothing left to arrange. The house itself seemed to know that its work was nearly done, and that what remained now belonged only to those who had chosen to linger until the night's final breath. The 16th hour was a moment suspended between two worlds. Outside, the first vendors were calling to one another. The Tiber's surface was catching the earliest glint of the sun, and the streets were beginning to hum again. Inside, the room still belonged to the night, its scents, its warmth, its quiet weight. For the three who remained, stepping beyond its walls would mean rejoining a world that had already moved on. And so they stayed, holding to this last fragment of darkness before the day claimed it entirely. In the 17th hour, the first light of dawn finally began to press more firmly against the edges of the domus. It did not flood the room all at once, but crept in cautiously, thin slivers of gray-blue filtering through the gaps where the curtains met, softening the shadows without yet breaking them. The air had changed entirely now. The warmth of the night had been replaced by a freshness that smelled faintly of damp stone, river water, and the faint smoke of early morning fires lit somewhere beyond the walls. The three guests were still there, though their stillness was different now. It was no longer the deep, unthinking rest of the night's final hours, but the hesitation that comes before a parting. Their eyes, when they opened, seemed slower to focus, as though each was still caught halfway between the enclosed warmth of the room and the awakening city outside. The brazier had gone cold. Ash lay in pale heaps where embers had once glowed, and the faint spiral of smoke had long since disappeared. The air held only the trace of cedar from hours before, lingering in the fabric of the cushions and in the folds of the blankets scattered across the floor. The lamps, too, were nearly spent. A few still held the smallest flicker, their flames trembling against the pull of the morning air. One guest sat forward now, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he were tracing the pattern of the mosaic beneath the tangle of discarded blankets. Another was quietly adjusting her hair, gathering the loose strands that had fallen during the long night, her movements slow and without urgency. The third remained reclined, his head turned toward the faint light leaking through the curtains, his expression unreadable. The painted walls were almost entirely swallowed by shadow, but the shapes were still there if one looked long enough. Venus, half lit, her face turned away. Apollo, his lyre barely visible in the dimness. A reclining satyr, the curve of his shoulder catching the weakest thread of light. They looked as if they too were on the verge of fading, their mythic stories dimming back into the plaster as the new day approached. Outside, the city was stirring more clearly now. Voices carried faintly, vendors calling out greetings, the clatter of shutters being opened, the uneven rhythm of hooves on cobblestones. The sounds were muted here, softened by the thick walls, but they could not be ignored entirely. They belonged to the day, and the day was drawing nearer. Still, no one moved toward the door. The moment felt too delicate, as though rising too quickly would scatter what remained of the night's presence. The domus seemed to understand this, holding onto its quiet just a little longer, resisting the pull of the world outside. The 17th hour was a threshold drawn thin. Inside there was still the weight of warmth, of shared breath, of silence shaped by hours of nearness. Outside there was the inevitability of movement, of noise, of daylight. The guests knew they would have to cross it soon, but for now, they let the minutes stretch, holding on to the last fragile threads before the first true light of morning pulled them apart. In the 18th hour, the morning could no longer be kept entirely outside. A faint, diffused light had begun to seep through the weave of the curtains, turning the edges of the room from shadow into a muted gray. The warmth of the night had drained away completely, replaced by the cool breath of dawn that slid along the floor and touched the guests' feet. The three who remained were no longer lying in the same heavy stillness. Their bodies had begun to shift, not with haste, but with the slow awareness that the night had finally loosened its hold. The man seated on the floor unfolded his legs, stretching them out until his toes brushed the cool mosaic tiles. The woman gathered the blanket around her shoulders a little tighter, as though trying to keep the night's fading heat against her skin. The last guest, still reclining, turned his face toward the thin spill of light, letting it touch him without yet rising to meet it. The brazier was now nothing more than a low mound of pale ash. Even the faint scent of cedar had thinned, leaving behind the dry, almost scentless air of a room that had burned itself clean. The lamps, too, were nearly done. Most had gone dark entirely, and the few that remained flickered as if they were breathing their last. Their glow was no longer strong enough to paint shadows. It simply lingered, clinging to the walls in small pools. The painted figures were half revealed in the dim gray. Venus looked softer now, less like a goddess than a woman caught in thought. The lyre in Apollo's hands was only a faint outline, the gold leaf no longer catching the dying light. The reclining satyr seemed to have drawn back into the plaster, his form less distinct as though the myths themselves were yielding to the morning. From beyond the walls came clearer sounds of the waking city. The shouts of vendors had grown sharper, the creak of cartwheels more frequent. A dog barked twice, quick and short, followed by the faint metallic rhythm of a blacksmith's first hammer strikes. These sounds slipped into the room without permission, like the day announcing that it had already begun, whether the guests wished to join it or not. Still, no one stood. There was a shared understanding in their slowness, an unspoken agreement to take what remained of the night for themselves before it dissolved completely. One of them reached for the last untouched cup of wine, lifting it carefully and sipping without ceremony. Another closed her eyes for a few more breaths, as though she could store the feeling of the air, the scents, the faint closeness of the others, and carry it into the day. The 18th hour was the final shelter, the last fold of darkness in which the night could hide. Within it, time was neither night nor morning, but something softer without the sharp edges of either. Soon the curtains would be drawn back, the doors opened, the voices raised in farewell. But for now, the three remained in their circle, holding on to a space that would not exist again in quite the same way, even if they returned tomorrow, or the next night, or years from now. The night was nearly gone, but it was still theirs, for just a little longer. In the 19th hour, the first true color of morning slipped into the room. It was no longer the pale, uncertain gray of dawn's earliest light, but a muted gold, softened by the curtains yet strong enough to reach across the floor. It moved slowly over the mosaics, touching the scattered cushions, the low tables, and finally the faces of those who had stayed until now. The guests had begun to rise, though not all at once. The man who had sat against the wall was the first to stand, his movements unhurried, as if each step away from the place he had occupied for hours needed its own measure of care. The woman unfolded herself from the blanket, letting it slide away from her shoulders so that the cool air could find her. The last guest lingered a moment longer on the couch, his hand resting on the armrest as though it were an anchor, before finally pushing himself upright. The brazier was cold, its ashes undisturbed. Around it, the remnants of the night lay in quiet disarray, a single cushion overturned, a silver cup tipped on its side with the last drop of wine clinging to its rim, a fig left uneaten on a plate as if someone had intended to return to it and forgotten. These small details seemed heavier now, their stillness a record of all that had happened before the morning claimed the space. The painted walls were clearer in this new light. The faces of the gods and mortals looked changed, not because the images themselves had shifted, but because the hour had. Venus's gaze, which in the lamplight had been warm and inviting, now seemed distant, almost indifferent. Apollo's lyre no longer shimmered. It was a painted instrument once more, silent and still. The satyr, caught mid-recline, seemed to be watching the guests as they moved, a witness to their leaving. From outside came the unmistakable rhythm of the city awake. The calls of the vendors were louder now, the clatter of wheels sharper, the air carrying with it the mingled scents of baking bread, fresh herbs, and the smoke of morning fires. The world beyond the domus was not waiting, it had already begun. Yet inside, there was still a final reluctance. The three moved slowly, not speaking of departure, only adjusting their garments, smoothing their hair, and glancing at the things they would leave behind. There was no need for formal farewells yet. The moment before stepping across the threshold still belonged to the night. The servants had returned quietly, their footsteps soft on the stone floors. They began to gather the empty cups, to fold the blankets, to push the cushions back toward their places. Their faces were calm, their movements deliberate, as though they understood the gravity of this last hour and did not wish to rush it. The 19th hour was not about lingering in the hope of returning to the night. It was about carrying its weight into the day. Each guest seemed to hold some fragment of it in themselves. The sound of a voice in low conversation, the warmth of a shared glance, the taste of wine taken slowly in the lamplight. The night had ended, but its shape remained, traced invisibly across their thoughts. And as they stood at the edge of leaving, they knew that the morning could not take that from them. In the 20th hour, the curtains were finally drawn back. The light that entered was soft yet undeniable, filling the chamber in a way the lamps never could. It spilled across the floor in wide, slow-moving shapes, catching on the silver rims of empty cups, brightening the folds of blankets still lying where they had fallen in the night. The air felt lighter now, though it carried the faint chill of the early day. The three guests stood together near the center of the room, their closeness less about warmth now and more about the unspoken pause before parting. They did not speak of the night just past. There was no need. Its details lingered in the scent of cedar still clinging to their garments, in the texture of the quiet that remained between them. Around them, the domus had begun its transformation. Servants moved through the space with measured efficiency, gathering the scattered remains of the evening. Cushions were lifted and shaken, blankets folded, low tables cleared of fruit peels and crumbs of soft cheese. The ashes from the brazier were swept into a bronze pan, leaving behind a faint circle of darker stone where the heat had been. The last of the lamps were extinguished, their smoke curling briefly into the morning air before disappearing. The painted walls, once half hidden in shadow, were now fully revealed. The gods and heroes seemed fixed again in their eternal postures, untouched by the long hours they had silently witnessed. Venus's eyes no longer glimmered with lamplight. Apollo's lyre was no more than pigment on plaster. The satyr's smile had stilled into something unreadable. They had withdrawn into the realm of story, waiting for the next night when they would seem to breathe again. From outside, the sounds of the city were insistent. The cries of vendors, the clink of amphorae being set down on market stalls, the rumble of carts over stone streets, all of it pressed faintly into the room now that the curtains were open. The scent of baking bread and fresh herbs drifted in, mingling with the fading perfume of the night. The guests began to move toward the doorway. Each step was slow, deliberate, not because they wished to delay, but because they understood the shift that came with crossing that threshold. Inside, the air still held the night's weight. Outside, the day waited with its demands, its light, its pace. At the entrance, they paused. There were no farewells spoken aloud, only the brief meeting of eyes, the smallest tilt of a smile, the subtle acknowledgement that what had been shared was not something that would be named. Then, one by one, they stepped into the open street, where the early sun caught on their hair and garments, erasing the shadows they had carried with them. The Doma stood quiet behind them, its rooms already returning to order, ready to hold its stillness until the next gathering. But for those who had been there through the hours, the night would not end so neatly. It would remain in the way their thoughts wandered later in the day, in the taste of wine remembered unexpectedly, in the feel of warmth beside them when they closed their eyes. The 20th hour was both an ending and a thread, leading back to the place where time had once slowed, and where the world outside had, for a little while, ceased to exist.